So today's guest is someone who's shaped not only the field of creativity research, but also me personally. I have the honor to interview Dr. Scott G. Isaksen, who was who was more than just a scholar in the field of creative problem solving. He was, or he is, a pioneer, a teacher, a mentor, and for me, most recently, a friend. So as the founder of Creative Problem Solving Group and one of the leading voices in translating creativity science into real world tools, Scott dedicated his life to helping people think more clearly, lead more effectively, and solve problems that truly matter. So his work influenced generations of researchers, educators, and leaders, and not only in New York, USA, but also across the world. So he has experienced about 50 years of creativity research, and I am more than humbled and blessed that we met in the latest stages of his career. But beyond the credentials, what always stayed with me was his way of being, grounded, generous, and fiercely curious. And I couldn't have hoped for a better mentor in my PhD research, so this is quite a personal interview for me. So this conversation is a tribute to that spirit, of course, and to the deep belief that Scott always carried, that creativity isn't just luxury, it's human necessity. And so with deep gratitude, I invite you into this special episode with Scott G. Isaksen. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your time and spending it with me.
Christian, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you, or should I say Dr. Cressman? Yeah. Congratulations again. I know it's been a while, but congratulations on that bit of accomplishment. The topic of creativity, as you know, is near and dear to my heart. And it's something that I started studying creativity in 1970. And I sit back sometimes and I wonder, wow, that's a long time ago. It's been a long and interesting journey, a winding journey, if you will. It started out, pretty much my first 25 years has been mostly academic, scientific, teaching in a university. The last 25 years, I'd say it's 80-20 academic. The first 25, it's been more 80-20 practical application. And then 20%, I can't give up being a professor. So that continued as well. And it gave me the opportunity to work with some fantastic people, yourself among them, and continue my learning journey. It's a never-ending story. Creativity is one of these topics that it's a living, breathing, morphing sort of thing. As we learn more, there's always more questions at the frontier. But we've made some progress regardless. I don't know if you know this personal story, Christian, but a little bit of context about who I was growing up. My dad was a scientist. He worked for AT&T Bell Labs, and my mom was an artist. And it was an interesting growing up period because my older brother became a nuclear physicist, and my younger brother became an electrical engineer. And I think about what I've become is an organizational psychologist that studies creativity in service of innovation inside organizations. So I'm the weird one in the family. I mean, I kind of blended the arts and the sciences. And so that's a little bit about me. I was fortunate to be involved in an experimental research project in 1970 at the university as I was a student. And the question was, can we deliberately develop creativity? And I was in the experimental group, and I met my wife, who was in the control group. And we kind of met each other at testing sessions and so on and so forth. And we celebrate 50 years of marriage this year. So it's been productive on a number of fronts, this diving into the field. Used to do a lot of reading and studying, a very eclectic program, but the theme in the program was very much about creative kinds of problem solving. It was about strategies, tools, techniques. And of course, exposure to arts and music and performance and theater, some marvelous experiences. And the bottom line after the 2-year study was, wow, it is possible to nurture and develop creativity. And that got me on a lifelong journey. I got my own mentorships going on. And it was very fruitful and very enjoyable. But along the way, I kind of titled this, in terms of preparation with you, Christian, I titled this conversation, Getting Beyond the Myth Conceptions. And I don't have a lisp. It was, and we say, you can easily say misconceptions, or you can say myth conceptions. Yeah. And along the time frame, as I work with a variety of people, I spend a lot of my time with senior leadership teams in organizations, trying to figure out, how do we create a creative environment? How do we develop and nurture creativity so that we can meet our innovation strategies and our goals? And along the way, when you interact with people, and people who are involved in the creative industries certainly will, I hope, relate to what I've experienced. There's 3 basic myths that I've run across, and I thought we could start with one anyway, please. And see where we go from there. I think people often see creativity as a mysterious concept, that it defies definition, that it's near to impossible. You just have to appreciate when it comes. You can't define it. Yes. And I think counter to that, I think we've come a long way in understanding what creativity is and trying to define it. Research can't happen if you don't have good definitions of your concepts. The interesting thing is that it's not one single thing. It's not one thing you can kind of isolate and say it's all about people, and it's about their creativity coming along the way, or it's all about the process, how people are creative, or it's about the outcome, the products, or it's the place that might, the venue, the milieu, the context, the environment. And I think the best way to kind of picture creativity, to move against the mystery myth, is to just acknowledge that you can kind of take any of those 4 basic lenses and you can define what creativity. You can look at creative traits and characteristics and styles of people and try to understand, what accounts for their creativity at the individual level or even at the group level. How do we manifest those creative characteristics more frequently in groups? And then even at a macro level, where I spend my time, organizationally, how do we look at the environment, the work environment, the climate, the culture that promotes creativity? So I think we can make progress on the definitions. We can kind of make some assumptions that are more productive. So rather than having a single nice, tight, and agreed definition, there's still tremendous debate in our field. If you look at any of the major journals that publish research and try to make some progress on understanding creativity, they make their definitions, but it's usually in one of these 4 camps: people, process, product, or place. And I think that's okay. I think it kind of allows us to embrace the full complexity of this thing we call creativity. So I can push back a little bit and say it's still productive. You don't have to just acknowledge that it's mysterious, that you can make progress as you kind of land on one of those. And very often the full picturing is trying to look at all 4 at the same time. It's kind of like the old color TV. If you only have one color, or black and white, versus you've got to mix those 4 colors together to get the full picture of what creativity is.
Why do you think there's this complexity in defining creativity?
Because I think it is, by the very nature of its concept, the concept itself, it's riddled with things like paradox. We kind of, around all 4 of these frames you can put on creativity, a constant theme is that it involves novelty, originality, newness on the one side. And on the other side, it involves some kind of usefulness, relevance, application, value. And when you put those things together, there's natural tension. novelty that's useful that's a paradox. How do you resolve that tension? It's part of what drives the complexity in the field. The other thing that drives the complexity from a people perspective is that there's not one trait. I mean, God forbid we ever come up with a creativity quotient like we have an IQ, because there are just so many different factors, so many personality factors that combine to predict creative behavior. Things like motivation, the skill level, basic ability. So it's not this finite, very concrete concept. It's much more of a dynamic concept, which also breeds its perception as a complex concept or idea.
I remember Donald Treffinger publishing a paper about the 100 definitions about creativity that really made me smile, because I was struggling with that in my PhD research quite extensively, because I was required to define what I actually want to do research about. And then realizing, well, it's really hard to do so.
And a lot of people, I think it's important to try to define so you can at least have a conversation about what it is you're trying to talk about. And working with Don over the years as a colleague and friend, he collected and published a wonderful series of articles about assessment of creativity and definitions. There are literally hundreds, depending on what the scholar is interested in and how they see it relating to the concept of creativity. So they breed a lot of different definitions. There are some themes, like I mentioned, almost all of them have that paradox. Almost all of them land at a point to say it's not a single thing. It's not a single characteristic, which just acknowledges that we're in a complex and ambiguous space, and it's wide open. A lot of people enter the field later in their careers. They may have, one of the more famous creativity researchers today is Teresa Amabile out of Harvard. And Teresa grew up here in Buffalo, and her first degrees were in chemistry. And she studied rust for I don't know. And it was later in her career, when she started her PhD at Stanford, that she kind of looked into this creativity area. And given her scientific background, she added a tremendous amount of value. So she entered the field a little bit later in her career, and has made a tremendous set of contributions to understanding and developing creativity. So it's not uncommon. The challenge with that, of course, is that when you enter late, it's easy to forget that there's a foundation of a tremendous amount of work that's been done. I think it's safe to say that serious study of creativity started at the turn of the last century. And so there's been a lot of investment of scholars who put their entire lives and colleagueship with others to work to try to understand this stuff. And when you enter the field as a newbie, it's easy to forget that all of that work has been done. What's interesting and kind of ironic in a way is that Harvard got this project going. It's a very famous, I won't mention their names because it's a little bit of a critique on them. But they started this project called Project Zero in the 1980s at Harvard. And the working assumption was that nothing worthwhile had been done to study creativity. And so they're going to start from scratch, Project Zero. And of course, they made some progress. They were smart people and had good resources, so they made some progress. Yet, all they did was replicate stuff we found out in the 40s and 50s and 60s, So it was, in a sense, it was a bit of a waste of the energy. So that's the challenge with the creativity field. A lot of people get interested late, and they may attach themselves to certain aspects. Like if once you get involved in understanding the creative process, and you kind of look at, there is a journey here of ideas and problems and solutions and all of that. Oftentimes folks would grab a hold of that and say, that's it. That's what I'm after. And they become, in a sense, tool masters. They're all about looking at the tools, and all of that's fine. But the thing, if it's done in isolation, they forget that you have to know kind of why you're using the tool and who needs to be involved in applying the tool and what can you expect as an outcome. and all those other questions. So I think the benefit is having being able to dig in. I used to ask Mo Stein, another very foundational creativity researcher, to join a graduate class of mine, and his mantra was read the literature to my grad students. And I used to love it when he used to say that, because I used to say the same sort of thing myself. But it's okay to start. I mean, obviously, with a fresh pair of eyes, it's useful. We have, as a result, there have been some advances. But to acknowledge that there's a tremendous amount of work that's going on in the field, and that's why I think it's important to push back against the myth conceptions of creativity along the way.
I'd love to continue chatting with you about these myth conceptions, but before that, I'd love to highlight that Teresa Amabile did a great job in bringing something new and very fundamental and at the same time original to the creativity research, because in my opinion, what she did is going back to the very foundation of what actually can be seen as creative, because as I understand her research, what she says is that people always decide whether something is creative or not with the consensual assessment technique. And other researchers, they try to standardize those criteria maybe, but at the very essence, it is made by humans as well. They decided on those criteria. So it is, to me, it is a very straightforward approach to measuring creativity in its wholeness, what she did. And she also made it transferable to other domains, or actually to every domain, which is kind of a unifying thing, and brought so much clarity in my personal research about creativity, because, well, who else decides what is creative when not a human being, either directly or indirectly? So this is quite unique what she did there. And
yeah. And again, let's not forget, she comes from chemistry.
Sure, me too. By the way,
right?
So those
not a bad science.
No.
Not a bad science at all, right? You know that. And having that in mind, so things that she's developed, like the consensual assessment technique, for example, is a way of saying, when you get a group of experts who know something about a field together, and if you can get agreement that people together see this as a creative outcome, you can have some assurance that they are working. It may be an implicit theory that they're using, but through the consensual assessment technique, you can make that agreement explicit. So you can get some sense, okay, this is creative. The time factor also gets involved. I mean, we can, sometimes you can't serve any wine before it's time type of thing, I mean, it could very well be that, time has a factor here. And this is why I think it's important to differentiate things like historical creativity, historical value. I mean, I have to say, one of my most significant aesthetic experiences was being in Austria at the time of Mozart's celebration of a 100th year of his death. And we went to the Mozart in Vienna. I went to the Mozart concert hall, and that experience was so awesome. The music filled all of us and to our soul. When they finished, it was like there was this period of silence, because we just experienced and it was not just me, it was the whole theater, it was the whole area. And the performers were so exhausted because they had put so much of their spirit and their energy into the performance. The conductor almost collapsed. It was that kind of an experience. And so you think about it, well, okay, was that just Mozart? Well, no, it was the performers, it was the audience together. And all of us could not have believed, we were all almost like exhausted. We couldn't move. So, I mean, appreciating the aesthetic experience that comes from great music, great art, great drama, the classics, if you will. There's a sense of timeliness, or almost a freedom from time boundness, that these things seem to last and can create those marvelous aesthetic experiences. And what would our lives be like if we didn't have those? if we weren't, as human beings, if we didn't have exposure to those aesthetic experiences. So it's not just, from a consensual assessment technique, the 500 people that were there all experienced that shared aesthetic experience. What a marvelous experience that was. So time gets involved in that, but she's certainly emphasized the importance of intrinsic motivation. She went a little too far. I worked with Teresa in Egypt on a UNESCO project, and we had this event where we were working on the development of creativity and trying to encourage that. The Minister of Education was there and all that kind of thing. And I remember distinctly saying, I think I agreed with her, of course, that intrinsic motivation plays a really key role in predicting creative behavior. But I had this experience set up where I had groups of people working on some ideation, practical exercise. And I kind of looked at Teresa and winked, and she was there with me, and they were generating ideas. And then I said, got a little update. I said, how you doing? How many have you generated? And then I said, the group that generates the most ideas will get this pen. And I had a special 4-color pen. I was deliberately introducing extrinsic motivation to idea generation. And of course, what happened was the fluency went up significantly across all groups. And then we had this little debate about, did that help or hinder your performance? And they actually said it helped. And we agreed that under certain conditions, an extrinsic stimulation can actually add some value. So it's not like just intrinsic motivation matters. It's also the absence of inappropriate extrinsic constraints. So we had a great dialogue, and of course her writing shifted on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So that's what I mean by it's a dynamic concept. It means that we start to improve our understanding. You follow Teresa's work from her early contributions in the 80s to where she is today, you'll see a tremendous growth and a little bit more complexity, a little more nuance to her work on creativity. So she's made a fantastic contribution to the field. Absolutely.
I think this highlights kind of the issue that we generally have with social studies, that we cannot grasp the wholeness of psychology or what decides how humans behave or what motivates them. Well, it's just a small blink or just a small hole we peek through, and we try to extrapolate any assumptions maybe reasoning from that. And
I think that's a very productive way of expressing the challenge around the complexity. We see a part of things. And that's why I think it's neat to say, let's look at this from a person lens, from a social psychological lens. Let's look at this as an outcome lens, or let's look at the context. Let's look at the environment. And when we go into I call it taking an ecological or a systems view, where you try to be more deliberate in expanding the perception of the creative process, creative people, and so on in interaction. And I'm a psychologist, so I'm very interested in behavior and the kind of behaviors that human beings express. Time-wise, we used to focus almost exclusively the early work in this field that broke the paradigm about, it happens accidentally. It's all about mystery. We focused on geniuses. We focused on eminent individuals. And it was the easy way out because you didn't have to define anything. Everyone could agree, right? Okay, Edison is a genius, or
Einstein, maybe,
whomever. Mozart was a genius. And so you didn't have to worry about all these other complexities. And I think over time, we started realizing that the tendency, the shift has been from just those lone geniuses, that we used to kind of, how do we understand what they did? And again, they looked at the outcomes. And in fact, what made them a genius was their historical contribution to an outcome, a product that led to an entirely new paradigm, a way of working. but they did so. It didn't just happen by accident, right? It didn't. They put a lot of work into this. Creativity involves a lot of work, and they worked really hard to shape their understanding and communicate it. But I think the movement has been from this exclusive focus on the genius, the highest level of creativity, to moving it more and more toward everyday creativity, to looking at people that, the genius within, that we all have some level of genius. Maybe it's not going to be at that absolutely high historical level, but that we have the capability, because it is, as you indicated, it's a human characteristic. It's a human quality. And it's a wonderful gift. So looking at this in terms of how do we infuse creativity within our schools, it's now seen as a life oriented skill, quality of life skill. It's broadly conceived as something worthwhile. Employers look for these characteristics when they try to look at hiring somebody in. So it's moved considerably from just a genius level. When I interviewed, I was asked when I took over the directorship of this academic center, my provost asked me to go out and talk to the other deans on campus and to get a sense of where the center was and what we needed to do to kind of grow it and move it forward. And I will never forget that one of the deans said, "You guys are a cult on campus." And it stuck with me. I'm going, well, that's interesting to see the perception that this unit is dedicated to human creativity is a cult. And so again, there's a little mythology associated with being a cult. And that gave me good feedback about how we had to kind of invest in some development projects and so on to clarify what we were about and so on. But I think moving from that cultish focus on genius level creativity, although obviously we can appreciate those outcomes even today, moving it more toward the everyday interaction of people solving problems. In a way, art is solving problems, right? Theater, you're solving a problem in a way. But I think the notion is we can move this so that everybody can connect to it. It's not the sole province of the genius, that we all have been given some level of that genius inside. How do we understand it? How do we manifest it? How do we produce outcomes? All of those things are relevant to a much more inclusive human connection, if you will.
I'd love to continue about the myth in a second, but before that, I want to pick up on your statement about the volume of ideas or the volume of things we produce as creatives as a necessity for something emerging as really creative. Let me expand on that. You mentioned Edison before, and it is said that it took him about 10,000 failed light bulbs till he finally could make one work. So there is sheer volume of trying to get something done. And I know it from my acting experience, and I know it from musicians who screw up really often on their performance or in their songwriting and all that until they finally hit something really gold. So it takes a minimum amount of volume to, I don't know, what is it, to make it happen or to create the circumstances that, or the probability that something creative can happen.
Yeah. And that implies so much about the process. I mean,
true.
When we think about how people can manifest their creative talent, so much of it relates on, novelty that's useful is a tension point, but you see it in every domain, in the arts and the sciences. All you have to do is go visit the Picasso Museum in Barcelona and look at, he was fascinated with a portrait of a royal family of Spain. And he focused in on a little girl. And there's an entire room where, we think of Picasso just making a couple of things on a canvas and that's it. No, but you start to get a little more insight into the work that's involved and the kind of fluency that it often takes. He has a whole room of this 40 some odd portrait trials. And then you can see he was not happy. He was not content. He wasn't done. He didn't feel he was finished until he got to about the 42nd portrait. And that one, of course, has a more prominent place. Well, that suggests in a way that the previous 41 or 42 were failures, right? And it didn't quite get to what he wanted to see and the kind of aesthetic response to that art that he was looking for. And it is the lesson about fluency matters. And you see it in many, many domains where people try. There's this level of, we call it passion or persistence. I mean, the idea of constant trial, working on generating many, it happens so often in science. It takes a lot of failures of experiments, accepting, rejecting the hypothesis. You try, and then, we don't get support for that. Well, what might, provide a better explanation? That notion of the journey that's riddled with persistence and passion. And what happens as a result is you see there's a trail of very many ideas, concepts, problem definitions that go on. It's very rare to have a high level creative output on your first trial. So that's it. The persistence and passion, that's back to the person, if you will. There's a characteristic that it takes. You're going to need to accept the fact if you decide you're going to go on a creative journey, it's going to take some work. And a part of that is the acceptance that the first thing that comes out may not be the outcome you're looking for. You have to maybe try and try again and produce many varied, original options to get to that point where you finally say, I think I've got something here. So that's why all four of those things come together, right? You're looking at the outcome and the reaction you want to see. The process is going to be of a journey. It's going to be some work. So maybe some experiencing some failure, accepting that, this wasn't good. This isn't what I'm looking for. And then trying again, trying a new approach. That's where the process can sometimes be very helpful, to look at, okay, I'm going to be on a journey here. It's not going to be exactly, the journey doesn't imply the destination. It implies the work, the energy that it takes to get to that destination. And that process, we understand a lot more now, both cognitively, metacognitively, and so on, how that process works and how people are different in how they contribute to that process. We've come a long way on that front.
What do you think makes a human being creative? So how can a Picasso stay consistent with his work, or an Edison creating 10,000 light bulbs, or just a regular guy like me trying to get this music piece out of his mind into the guitar and singing and all that? So what is the necessity or the requirements someone has to have that he or she is creative?
Oh, wow. I think there's a lot of different kinds of requirements, because once you're engaged in that journey, Christian, I mean, so many things come into play. I mean, to some extent, sometimes in the creative space, you almost have to wait till it feels right, right? It feels right. It's in the gut. And that aesthetic experience has a lot of gut involved, right? You just know that you've gotten there. But obviously, it doesn't happen the minute you put yourself together with a guitar. I mean, that notion of trial and inquiring. So what we look at in the process is that there's a whole category of work in the journey that, in a way, you're kind of defining what it is you want to create. You're trying to get some degree of clarity about the aim you have in mind. To some cases, it may be it starts out pretty intuitive, but at some point you get an understanding of some clarity about the problem you're trying to solve. And then once you're looking for it, you have some image, something that tells your gut that it's there. And then you start looking at the options. You start looking at generating some alternatives. What key do I want to start in, and all of those sorts of questions. You start looking at options, and then you listen along the way and that doesn't sound right. So I'm going to try another key to start in or whatever, right? And so there's an ideation stage of some sort. And it may be that you start ideating right away and then realize in the process of ideating, you go back to say, what am I really trying to do here? It doesn't happen in a linear, prescribed way. But those aspects of the stages, if you will, they seem to be present. And then it's working out the details. Once you have the ideas, you start to maybe play in a particular key. Then you start working out the piece, and you take it a little further, and you see how it fits together. And then how does that fit with the words I have in mind and the message that I want to send? And you're working out all those details, right? And it's taking action, and playing and developing and strengthening the options till you get to that point where you say, I think I've got it. So looking at that stuff, I mean, I think everybody, in a cognitive sense or an emotional sense, affective, those stages exist. And you know what? You look at the geniuses, they did the same thing. I mean, those stages existed for them, and they exist for all of us. So sometimes just being aware of the stages that the journey entails, and maybe looking at how you want to approach that can make an individual more effective. We've learned over the years that it is possible to deliberately develop creativity. That and certainly creative problem solving is one of the more well-known frameworks for helping people do that. We've got tremendous research that supports that at the educational level or the business and organizational level. The arts have been a little harder to get into, although I think now that we're looking at problem framing, the arts are a little bit more amenable to that, the science of creativity, the seriousness that you can go into. But even without the heavy emphasis on cognition and metacognition and social metacognition, I think just the recognition that, it's okay to be on this journey, and it's okay to go backwards sometimes to go forwards. And you're going to have maybe you've chosen a particular route and it turns out not to be productive. Okay. We all have some biases to overcome there. So it's okay to say, I think I'm going to back out of this one and try an alternative. And that accepting that there is a process and there's a journey there. My mom was with us. I took the kids out to Sedona, Arizona. It's a beautiful red rock, gorgeous area of the country. And I was doing a little session with some business people, a little retreat. So I had my family there, my mom there. And she asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, we're dealing with a strategy. We're trying to introduce some creativity to how we're thinking about the strategy for this business. And then I thought, oh, my mom, she's an artist. I'll try having a conversation with her about creativity. And she said to me, no. She said, I don't want to talk about creativity. It'll chase my muse away. Yeah. So that's it. So for her, it's a matter of a completely intuitive aesthetic experience. And you know what? That's a way of approaching creativity. I can't dismiss it. But then what was interesting was about an hour later, my kids were interested she was doing a little watercolor from what she was seeing in the red rocks and the beauty that was there. And she said, would you like to learn how to do watercolors? And then she took my children off and taught them how to do watercolor in art. So, I mean, there's, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, there is a process that's involved. There's a journey we can describe, and we can benefit from having even sometimes an explicit understanding of that process. That's where the tools and techniques, and it can be an individual journey, but nowadays, a lot of my time was spent with senior management teams where they had no choice but to create a group journey. They had to, some of these things are very complicated. You have to have finance involved in HR and product development and marketing and sales, all involved in trying to create this image of what they wanted to create. And to do that, it's very helpful to start to say, well, where are we on our journey? Do we already have a clear understanding of the need? Might we explore that space? Can we get together on that? Can we get some consensus and agreement? So there's this balance, this dynamic balance that happens along the way about generating divergent thinking and then convergent thinking and focusing. And again, it's a back and forth, iterative, intercyclic sort of interaction that occurs. But the idea is that maybe we can actually begin to define this process, look at some stages that we can maybe facilitate that, particularly in groups. Not all creativity happens. I mean, the source is always an individual, But very often when you're creating something, I mean, there are collaborative arts, there are collaborative music compositions, and so on. So can we look at this as a shared journey and start looking at how we kind of talk about the process rather than just saying, I can't talk about it. Maybe we should, where are we? Do we need some ideas, or do we already have our ideas and we need to flesh those out and get some acceptance? That can be extremely productive. And that's been a lot of my experience in working with organizations, but it's based on the basic essential, the foundations of creativity, if you will.
What I get from that is bringing consciousness into something that is unconscious, and by shedding light on something that lies within the shadows, we can then maybe transfer those processes into other areas of life, or we can, with that added consciousness, we can maybe enjoy the process even more, or at the other hand, teach it like your mother taught your children, how they can embrace their own creativity.
Yeah. I think it's natural that there's great literature on the notion of incubation and the notion of intuition in the process, and to some extent, I mean, you can't ignore that there are clearly examples where someone gets this immense aha. You have Poincaré making a step on the bus and getting a flash of insight. But remember that he was working on that problem of geometry for 10 years. And he tried so many different things out, and he was looking, but it wasn't top of mind. It wasn't extremely conscious. So the big story was, of course, he's taking that arc of a step onto a bus, and then all of a sudden sees aha, and so we have lots of examples of aha, and the idea is that, again, the myth there is so we have the mysterious myth we've talked about. The myth there is about magic, that creativity is a magic. I mean, we appreciate the outcome. The aha is the important thing, and we forget about all the work that Poincaré did prior to prepare himself to get that aha. Yeah. And then when he got the aha, that wasn't enough. He had to go back. He had to write it up. He had to do the geometric proofs to show that insight had value. So again, that level of consciousness seems to be really important. And it's okay. Sometimes the ahas occur. I mean, those insights, and we know that it's almost like a mini aesthetic experience, right? Your gut lets you know, wow, I really got something here.
That would be quite a nice transition to the other myth of creativity. So the second one is the magic of creativity, or how would...
Magic.
Please.
Yeah. A magician never wants to tell anybody how they get to their act. So people are just enamored. How did you make predictions about that card? And there's obviously the magician has a process. They've been well prepared to perform their magic. And they don't want to tell you what's behind the curtain. They just want you to appreciate the outcome. Well, there's nothing wrong with appreciating an outcome of magic, much like there was nothing wrong about me experiencing Mozart Concert Hall and having that aesthetic experience. But my appreciation of that experience was different because of the lens that I bring to creativity. I really think about the hours and months that these individual performers practiced, and then how they practiced together, and how the conductor mixed the emphasis of the sounds and prepared that. The amount of energy and passion and commitment that was involved in that experience. So, people did not just come off the street and get up on stage and pick up a violin and start playing it. There was a tremendous preparation for that, and they all knew it. This is the beauty of that experience. They all knew that something had been created there that was beyond normal, that was clearly a creative experience. And so I think seeing the picture more fully, back to your point about the lens in that we take, starting to understand those outcomes, that I love the outcomes, that life would not be good if we didn't have those outcomes. But boy, if we can start to unravel a little bit more about the kind of characteristics that need to be brought to bear and the kind of journey that it takes, a little more conscious effort at times, I think anybody, particularly in the creative industries, it's not just a magical event. You don't just sit there and go, oh, at 3:00 I plan on having an aha. it just doesn't happen like that. It's just, so in a way, it's not as predictable, because as you're engaged, there's an involvement there that allows you to be more spontaneous and more iterative. And maybe at certain points you realize this isn't giving me what I need. I've got to back away. I've got to just say, that's not what I want. I need to go somewhere else. So that acceptance of some failure of the route that you're taking along the way. But some degree of consciousness and some degree of deliberateness can be very helpful. To writers get writer's block. I mean, I write a lot of articles, and trust me, I know there's writer's block. You get to a point where you have all the data, and you just don't know, well, how am I going to communicate this? How am I going to go about that? And stepping away sometimes is a key part of the journey, allowing for incubation to occur. But being and saying, knowing that, hey, it's probably time for some incubation break. That conscious decision to say, I'm going to back away and trust that ultimately the insights will come, and maybe I'll jot some ideas down here or there. And, where are people where they get their great insights? It's usually not at work, not at their desk. It's usually taking a shower, taking a run, having an intimate time, it's just understanding the way the mind works cognitively and emotionally, and how those two things obviously very interrelated, and then acknowledging all that on the journey. I think we can all benefit from that kind of consciousness and that kind of deliberateness along the way. But then the magic thing says you have to kind of look behind the curtain sometimes. It's okay to look at how did that trick occur, and so magic's another key myth conception. Creativity is magical, or creativity is mysterious, how we talked about that.
I think we're moving on two lanes at the same time here, because you talked about your experience at the opera or at the concert hall, and about you having this background of creativity research that enabled you to see the complexity and the richness of that performance in all different levels, and to cherish this sheer amount of work that they put into, and other people might not have seen this complexity. And this reminds me of kind of an okay-ish comparison, because I like good food. I really enjoy good food, but I also like to cook, so I can see if great food has been cooked by the sheer amount of work that needs to be put into the work, like the selection of the right ingredients, what goes into that, and then the preparation, the cutting, and then so many details and aspects. Same is true for me and the filmmaking. Years ago, I just watched the movies for enjoyment, but now as I'm making movies myself, I'm just baffled by what people can achieve by the technicalities of how to shoot that movie, and then have the same experience seeing on screen what the results is. So that is the preface of this of the question now. What do you think? Can laymen appreciate creativity the same as professionals in that field, or is there a quality that unites people?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Particularly in the everyday world, Christian, I think that it was clear to me that, I had a unique background sitting in my chair listening to Mozart. But it was clear to me also that because there was absolute silence, and then when the applause finally did erupt, it was so massive, and we didn't want to go away. It was like we just want to hang on. So it was a shared aesthetic experience. So I think we all have that. It wasn't just my gut that felt marvelous and wonderful, spiritually fulfilled about that experience. It was just amazing when we just all wanted to talk with each other. We wanted to hang out because we had this shared experience. So it's not. I wasn't the only one just because I was a creativity expert. It's like we all had that feeling. But I think what happened is I was with a few friends as we were going through the concert, and afterwards we went for a drink afterwards, and we were talking, and it ended up being a great conversation because they were all about the experience and how wonderful it was. And then I said, well, I think you have to kind of acknowledge these people really, the hard work that they did. It wasn't just the first string violinist did not carry the load. It was a complete cooperative effort that took a tremendous amount of give and take and practice and work. And then they started, oh yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just a magical, for us, it was a magical experience, but we could all acknowledge that, wow, there was a tremendous amount of preparation, and they knew that they had something special. I mean, like I said, the conductor almost fell over. He was exhausted. All the players were exhausted, but you could tell afterwards when the applause, we wouldn't stop clapping. Everyone on stage realized, they looked at each other, and there was a smile, that natural smile response when you have that positive aesthetic experience. So I think it's something that, I mean, for me, it gave me a deeper appreciation of what preceded that experience. And then the question then was, what does that mean to me? And that's something that happened years ago, Christian, but just even talking about that experience, I'm starting to feel really good in my gut. Those aesthetic experiences stay with us, and they inform, and they make a well-tuned detector, if you will, of other potential experiences that are aesthetic in nature.
It also creates.
So I don't think I wasn't the only one that had it. I might have looked a little more deeply into and acknowledged part of what made it so aesthetic is that beautiful together musical experience that we all heard. I had a deep appreciation for how it may have occurred, it attended, and how it evolved over time.
It is also quite a good reasoning or argument why creative people should exist in society, because of the impact they have on all the other human beings in that society. Because I think you and all the other 500, 1,000 people, I don't know how many have been in the audience, now carry that great experience within themselves, and they inform others. And so it's kind of raising societal energy levels. I don't know how to say it otherwise, but this is a strong argument for me.
Another example is the day after Brian and I went to go see the Freud Museum and get that experience. As a psychologist, I had to go. I couldn't ignore that, right? And as we were having a cup of coffee afterwards, a couple that were at the concert we recognized, and they came, and immediately when we saw each other, we just smiled again, and it was like we were best friends, because we shared that aesthetic movement. So I think we can easily underestimate the power and the productive, positive power that's in those shared positive aesthetic experiences. We have to be mindful that sometimes, there's a malevolent potential that can happen in those things as well. But I think there's tremendous positive power in those shared experiences, and it reminds us about what it means to be human. And it happens at all levels. I mean, for Don Treffinger and I were very interested in looking at education, particularly with young kids. And when I was teaching young kids, part of what you don't get paid very much when you teach here in the U.S. But the pay for me was when you'd see those epiphanies occur in the kids, when they get those ahas for themselves. That was my payment. That was my return on my investment in teaching. And so it happens at a variety of levels. I think being aware of that and trying to nurture that in others is a very worthwhile level of activity and work, and a very meaningful kind of work. That's one last myth that I run into a lot. So you get the mystery and the magic. The last one for me is madness.
Please.
Creativity is seen as madness, and that's what the notion of malevolent creativity kind of reminded me about that other myth. And I think, as a psychologist, if we go looking for pathology, we'll find it. But if you go looking for the positive aspects of creativity, we know, for example, that in the field of writing, novelists and so on, so creative writers, when we measure their personalities, they do come up a little bit neurotic. Okay. But particularly the act of writing and producing written material is also a balancing act. It is very healthy for them. So I think if you look for pathology, you'll find it. But I think in general, the positive psychology movement would say that being in tune with your own creativity, being involved and engaged in the creative process, is essentially a healthy human activity. And whether it's the arts or the sciences or writing, whatever the domain is that you want to deliberately express and engage your creative process and creative talents, it's going to, at the end of the day, yield some value, yield something like you were mentioning, to society, to communities overall. So I think it's important to, again, it's okay to acknowledge the mystery and the magic and the madness that's out there, but you need to be able to counter that with a more productive stance on creativity to make progress.
So the other way of saying that with the madness is we need to cherish our need to express ourselves, because if we don't follow this passion, then we turn mad. But by answering to that inner calling, maybe we counteract the potential to getting mad. I don't know if that is a way of saying it.
Yeah. I mean, madness is a very general term, but I mean, it's the idea that, a lot of folks, when you start the conversation about creativity on a flight, very often someone, the conversation, well, what do you do? And I always I roll my eyes and go, here we go. I'm going to tell them about creativity. And, and oftentimes they'll express the mystery or madness, or, it to me, it's in the magic. It always comes up. But I think on the madness side, it's like they don't want to come to. They see creativity as just the novelty side, the weird side. And to be honest, if you're going to get novelty that's useful, you have to have that side there. The novelty the originality has to be part of the pursuit. Yeah. And if it's taken too far and the equation doesn't balance in terms of the usefulness, people will often judge it as weird, mad, nonsense. And another part of that bucket is oh, you're involved in creativity, so you do arts and crafts with kids. It's like, no. But I think getting beyond the myth conceptions is just a very fruitful exercise, and it's good for everybody to do that, and particularly those in the creative enterprises can benefit. I mean, a lot of our work in creativity comes from this guy named Alex Osborne way back in the 50s. And he wrote a book called Applied Imagination. It was, for a lot of us in the field of creativity, it was a milestone book. It broke the paradigm, if you will, about creativity. But he was in advertising. And having done a lot of work in the advertising field myself, you do get you walk into this all the time. There are the creatives and there are the suits. And the environment for the creatives is always a little interesting when you go in an advertising firm. And the environment for the suits is they're dressed up and they're working with clients and doing financial projections and sales and da-da-da-da. And Alex used to say that, he used to hire the best and the brightest creatives he could find and the best and the brightest suits he could find, but that they were like two camps. And they had their very definite boundaries. A meeting ground was common area, but the creatives had their space and the suits had their space, and it looked and felt different. And he just said, we've got to figure out how to get this working together better. We've got to get the creatives and suits working together. And that led to the development of creative problem solving and his more famous technique of brainstorming and so on and so forth. But for him, the problem was, how do I get the best value out of both worlds? Novelty and usefulness, the essential tension that's in the work and in the creative domain. And he worked on it. He kind of felt it was about collaboration, creative collaboration. And again, if you start to go down that route, you see fantastic examples. We tend to credit Edison with the light bulb, but there was an entire team involved, and there's some change in the team membership over time. It wasn't just the lone genius working along the way. A lot of the output that what it takes often to resolve the tension of novelty that's useful is it takes some collaboration with others. The collaboration I had with Don Treffing over the years is he was an educational psychologist. I'm more interested in organizations, and where we'd come together was where we did a lot of our development, and I think we added some value to the whole journey on creative problem solving as a result. So that creative collaboration by groups is very important. That's, practically speaking, that's where I spent a great deal of my time trying to help finance, HR, sales, and marketing, and the CEO all work together because they realized they had to. That you don't get transformation, organizational transformation, without that kind of collaboration across disciplines. And it's the same when we can finally see that there's a lot more academic acceptance of the study of and the development of creativity. But for a while, remember, we were seen as a cult on campus. The old disciplines were seeing this creativity space and going, what are you? You're just a cult on campus. Nowadays, it's no, actually, it's a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary acceptance that creativity is an important human characteristic, and we need to figure it out and try to develop it, cherish it, appreciate it, value it.
I think the collaboration aspect really picks up on the very essence of creativity, transferring one idea into another context and making it somehow work, because that is kind of the idea of newness, to bringing something that is already in existence into another context where it wasn't perceived as currently existing before. And what I get from your statement is that this is basically what happens when you collaborate with, for instance, Donald Treffinger, that he brought in his context or his mindset and you brought in yours, and you both met at a new ground because there were some transferring insights or ideas.
Yeah, we were interested in not just the educational context, but again, these are, like we said, there's a more universal understanding and acceptance if you can kind of make it work where those meeting grounds come together. The not-for-profit educational with the for-profit organizational, and you start realizing, wow, some of the same things are there. The same dynamics of process seem to occur. And it just allowed CPS to become more broadly applicable as a result, which was what was one of our aims, which we were hoping for,
I came across your work by using the CPS 6.1 framework, then later on using the view assessment, which is now transferred to another company, to still keep it going, because you are at the end of your career, as you say, but you still want to keep the spirit living. If you take a look in the future, what do you think is kind of a forecast about the creativity research? Where will it go? What do you think will happen next? What needs to happen next, maybe?
Well, I think that currently, we see there are a few frontiers that I think we're looking at when it comes to understanding and developing creativity. And we for a while, like in the mid-90s, we had this explosion of software and all of that kind of stuff. And I went down, I looked at the book we put out on creative problem solving in the mid-90s, and we had this whole list of software for each of the stages that would help support the software, the cognitive activity and collaborative activity. And when I checked just a few months ago, none of the software is available anymore. The dynamics of that space, where we're now dealing with AI and large language models and ChatGPT and so on and so forth, and the role that can play. And in some cases, if you look at the consensual assessment technique, for example, some output from AI is clearly creative. So it meets some of the basic understandings of creativity. But there's a human element there that I'm more interested in, and it's relying on ChatGPT to do your term paper is one thing, but what does that do for you in terms of your learning? And back to that notion of having an aesthetic experience. I'm not sure AI at this stage or anytime in the short-term future is capable of an aesthetic experience. And so there's some parts of what we're engaged in creativity that probably need to be kind of held in the human domain. But I think there's a lot of things that AI offers that can actually enable us. Think about information retrieval, the preparation that goes on in the creative process. Back, I'm an old fart. So when I used to do my research, you go to the library, you pull books off of shelves, you actually open a book and read or find a journal and take it off the shelf. And, use a typewriter to type your dissertation. Had to be page perfect. So lots of pages had to be retyped. This was before word processing. So the technological arena, I think, Christian, is one of those areas to keep an eye on, because the dynamics, like anything like that, sees that there's so much value that's in these large LLMs and AI that would enable more creativity. I believe it's a set of tools and resources to be applied. How we go about doing that, I think already the learning curve is kicking in already. I believe at some stage we'll have a much better understanding of the role that AI can play to enhance creativity. But at the same time, I don't want us to forget that again, there's not a level of consciousness in that space. Remember, we were dealing with algorithms, zeros and ones at the end of the day, and we don't want to imbue that with spirit, soul, aesthetic experience. These things are important. That humans have to be engaged and maybe oversee to some extent that context. Finding that right way, that's a whole new pathway that we have to kind of just accept it. There's some learning that has to go on here and some acceptance of this new technology. I think the other bit would be it's based in some part on the knowledge domains and the spread of information that's there. I think there's an ethic, moral component that it's easy to forget about. We're talking about AI and ChatGPT. Both of us are saying we can use all sorts of this technology. There's how many billion people are on this planet, and what percentage of them have access to AI? And are we saying that other folks that don't have access don't play the game? They're not involved in the journey? That kind of separation is worrisome. And so I think that there's some value in having conversations and thinking a bit about the ethical and moral obligations that kind of are in a larger picture as we think about the creativity space working away. If it's human, and I believe it is, and there's a human component that needs to be there at all stages, then how inclusive are we really being here? And what does that mean for us? And how do we find ways to get more value? And I mean, I don't think it would hurt the world to see a more creative trend to education globally. And I know there's geopolitics involved in that statement, but I really believe that. And so there's an opportunity space there, I think, Christian, as well. So the two big things for me would be the technological trend and then the moral, ethical issues around the world. And we in April 21st, I think it is, we celebrate World Creativity Day, and it started out as an idea in 2 or 3 countries, and now I think it's UN has endorsed it. It's now a global thing where people take a day to kind of celebrate creativity in its variety of forms. And so, given that human engagement, I think that's important to figure out ways to engage more. It's good for individuals, it's good for groups, it's good for organizations, it's good for societies. And how do we make that happen in a morally good way? And I think that's a frontier that you don't hear a lot of voices clamoring in that area, but I think we have to confront it at some point along the way.
That's very insightful, and also answers to the rising question of diversity and inclusion. And it kind of aligns those two topics altogether. So
I think the misstep on the diversity side, I used to work with Martin Luther King Institute here at SUNY, and I think the misstep has been the way diversity has been perceived is at a surface level. We look at gender, age, race, and I understand that. I mean, that's the most obvious way of seeing a difference. But I think when on the creativity space, it goes well beyond gender, age, and race. It comes back to how we think, how we perceive, how we understand things. The real value, you can have people that are gender diverse, age diverse, and race diverse, but they can all be thinking the same way. And so I think we have to kind of search for a deeper understanding of diversity. And the notion of equity versus equality is also, that's a moral and ethical conversation to have. I think you'd find that a lot of people would agree having an equal opportunity to use creativity is important. Believing in equity. Equity implies sameness. And there's, to me, that, again, back to the notion of what is novel and useful. Novel kind of pushes back on the notion of everyone should land at the same spot, or everyone should be treated exactly the same. We're so different, you know? There's billions of us around, but each one of us is different. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but when it comes to the creative space in particular, the choices we've made, the kind of experiences we've had, I think it's important to recognize the differences along that. So I think that's part of where I think the moral and ethical conversation should go around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's it. Rejecting it is silly. I mean, there's so much value in understanding and accepting diversity, but getting beyond the simple stuff, I think, is much more important.
So we have been spending quite some time now, and I'd love to spend a few hours more. But for the sake of this episode, would you like to wrap it up by maybe giving your younger self an advice, or maybe the young creatives? What is the most important thing that you would like to emphasize, or what you learned in your 50 years of creativity research?
I think if I look back, and I look at, I love my mom, the artist, and I love my dad, the scientist. And it created a little confusion in me. My older and younger brother, it didn't confuse them at all. They were going with a male role model, and they were going to become in the science and technology area. I like both of them. And I think it opened me up. And I think being open and accepting, open to experience is a key personal trait. I think that was very helpful. What lesson I've learned that I would love to have known as a youngster is, when you're open to experience, you're open to a lot more failure, and you're open to make a lot more mistakes. And I think within boundaries, I mean, just accepting that that's part of the deal. We only want the positive aspect of open to experience, but it just means that you're going to fall, and you're going to run into things. You're going to make some mistakes, and you're going to have a lot of errors. Some of them will be very meaningful if you're in a space that's kind of ambiguous and ill-defined, and you're open to that. It's more likely that you're going to fall and you're going to hit the wall.
I really learned a great deal in this conversation, so I'm really glad that I could have the opportunity. So thank you so much for being here, Scott.